Hello. Welcome to Applying a Racial Equity Lens to the Building of Crisis Systems. For this webinar, attendees will be in listen-only mode. If you need technical assistance, please submit your request under the Tech tab on your screen. If you wish to submit a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A window on your screen. We'll try to answer all questions during the webinar. If an in-depth answer is needed or we run out of time, we'll try to answer your question at a later time via email. The presentation will now be turned over to Kirby Garrity.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirby Garrity, and I am the Program Manager for Justice Initiatives with the National League of Cities, Institute for Youth Education and Families. As you'll see on this title slide, my colleague Tony McCrite was supposed to join me today, but due to varied commitments, he is presenting at the Cities United Conference, so we wish him luck there today. I want to welcome all of our attendees to this session titled Applying a Race Equity Lens When Implementing Crisis Response, where I'll be joined with 4 great presenters who I'll introduce you to shortly. Before I get into why this conversation is so important, I just want to give you a little bit of background information about the work we're doing at NLC to support cities in reimagining public safety, racial equity, and injustice transformation. I want to recognize the important work that my NLC colleagues on our Race, Equity, and Leadership team do, or REAL, with cities, from action guides to trainings, case studies. The NLC REAL team offers a number of resources to strengthen local leaders' knowledge and capacity to eliminate racial disparities, heal racial divisions, and build more equitable communities. As far as my team, the Justice Initiatives team, we serve as a strategic ally with the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge, and have been convening peer learning networks of local leaders to really dig in deeper to topics like equitable jail reduction, alternative response, violence reduction and interruption, young adult justice, and more over the last 2 years. More recently, after the murder of George Floyd, the team at NLC convened a task force of local elected officials around the topic of reimagining public safety at the local level. The task force met for over 6 months and also held topical listening sessions before coming together around 5 recommendations for city leaders. Those recommendations are to be released in a report early next week. That report will also be paired with a toolkit for municipal leaders to be released next month during our annual city summit. As I transition into talking about the conversation this afternoon, I want to highlight one of those recommendations due to its relevance, and that is to significantly expand the use of civilian-led and community-based well-being and prevention-focused strategies. This recommendation highlights things like co-response, community response, and violence intervention as key steps for city leaders to take toward reimagining public safety. As cities look toward these various types of alternative responses, the importance of equity in planning, design, and implementation is paramount. As is the case for many initiatives, it can sometimes be an afterthought. So before we hear from our panelists today, I just want to highlight some key points for consideration as it relates to equitable response. The first is around resident engagement. When planning and designing new response mechanisms, engaging residents, specifically those that are most impacted and often left out of conversations, is a crucial first step. Additionally, other non-traditional stakeholders can support in these efforts, like credible messengers and other trusted community members, and they must be at the table. And engagement has to go beyond simply a survey or questionnaire, but actual partnerships with residents throughout the process. Next, I want to talk about equity as it relates to preparation for implementation. Some questions that we can ask ourselves as we start to think about preparing to implement a program is: how do we select responders? How are they trained? What type of tools are needed for screening? How do we ensure that in response, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities are centered? And how do we manage things like gender equity and intersectionality when managing response programs? These questions can guide local teams toward solid frameworks that have an equity lens. Finally, when we think about implementation, an important piece is how do we track data and patterns? How do we ensure that there are not disparities in the way we respond to crisis? How do we pivot and revise things as they start to go in a direction that we didn't want to see? Obviously, this will look different for different places across the country, but nonetheless, it's important to be intentional and engage all relevant parties from the very start. Many of these things will be touched on by our speakers, as will the challenges and successes that they're experiencing locally as it relates to response and equity. So now I do want to introduce you to our 4 panelists. Their full and impressive bios are available on the conference site, so I won't go into too much detail. But with us today, we have from Madison, Wisconsin, Assistant Chief of Police John Patterson and Anthony Cooper of the Nehemiah Group, who will share about their collaborative response work. From Rochester, New York, we have Council Vice President Willie Lightfoot, who happens to be a part of our Reimagining Public Safety Task Force, and will share about Rochester's innovations as it relates to people in crisis. And last but not least, from Indianapolis, Indiana, we have Lena Hackett, who will discuss the Assessment and Intervention Center in Marion County. So I want to thank all four of you for being here this afternoon, and I'm going to hand it over to John and Anthony to kick things off.
Thank you, Kirby. Coop and I have not scripted this, so Coop, do you want to start us off, or would you like me to start?
Sure, you can go ahead and start things off, and then I can, I'll go ahead and throw things your way, and then it can come back to me. How about that?
That sounds good. Thanks, Coop. So thank you all for
Yes,
dialing in today and for listening. So Anthony and I are in Madison, Wisconsin. If you're not familiar, we basically lie the southern part of Wisconsin. We're about 2 hours northwest of Chicago and about an hour west of Milwaukee. We're the second largest city in the state of Wisconsin, just over 250,000 people. We have around 100 or so thousand commuters every day, so it's a decent sized community, obviously. I've been with the police department for the last 24 years, and I think I've worked with Anthony. I call him Coop. I've worked with Coop for, I don't know, Coop probably since 2014, I think, is when we first met.
yeah,
And really, our work began around an initiative that I was leading at the time. It was a focused deterrence initiative around high risk violent repeat offenders. And Coop was a member of the Community Against Violence group at that time, really trying to make an effort to offer services, mentoring services in particular, to some of these
hmm
folks in the community, and try to collaborate and divert them away from recidivism and from reoffending. And the relationship has really grown. We Coop throughout the years to
yep.
where now we talk to you about outreach and our community safety worker program. Um, and Coop, if you want to build off that, otherwise I can keep going.
Yeah, I can go ahead and jump in. So there's a few different things. Well, I want to say thanks, JP, Chief Patterson, but as we call each other by nicknames, and became friends over the years, and being able to combat a lot of the violence and things that have happened in our community, but then also being able to look outside of the box when and look outside of the box to being able to really create different ways of instead of incarceration, or if they meaning law enforcement um, thought, hey, this individual may need some other additional support, whether if it's being able to talk to a drug counselor, or being able to find housing, being able to find employment. And that was really something that I really enjoyed about having that relationship and being able to talk outside the box and being able to provide additional resources. Now, so as I don't know if you want to, well, I'll just talk a little bit more about focus interruption. So, with our relationship with MPD, we've been able to really not only talk with families that have been involved with violent incidents, but then also being able to respond on the scene as well as at the hospital, because we all know that families basically they need that additional support, where that support and what that support may look like, being able to navigate the communications at the hospital, but even at times being able to navigate um, and talking with law enforcement and saying, hey, you know what, I need to be able to see if this is my brother, if this is my sister or my father or my mother. And then being a trusted person that was working in the community for so long. Now, I'm also a person who also has had the lived experience from violence, but then also there was a time that I was incarcerated and went to prison as well. And so people know me in the community. I made an effort to be able to change my life, but then also there's other people that who who are connected with me. So we kind of make sure that we're all supporting each other. I've been known for doing job development in our community by networking with different employers, and also networking with different. Yeah, yes, I am hearing that feedback. I don't know where it's coming from. Um, Networking with different employers. I also ended up becoming a national recruiter and also owning my own business doing job development for the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. So most people that who have the same similar lived experience as me has just saw the way how not only me changing my life around, but then also what that navigation looked like. And knowing that, there's other partners in the community that was able to help us to be able to build that additional support for individuals that, whether if it was centered around gun violence or if it was centered around individuals that who were being released from prison. Um, you know, again, and many as I say often, is the fact that we all need some type of guiding light. We all also in that guiding light is the fact of being able to see someone or see multiple people, knowing that it's possible to do something different with your life. And so for myself, and having a relationship not only with MPD, but then also having relationships with other individuals throughout the community, with our urban leagues, our job centers, and things of that nature. I've been blessed with being able to have the opportunity to be in, and I also have to make sure I mention in our churches in our community as well, to being able to have the hard conversations, but being able to be straight to the point with people. And this is on all sides with our government as well as our churches and our brothers and sisters that are in the community as well, to be able to help people look outside the box for that additional assistance if needed. So I can. Oh, I'm sorry, JP. Do you want to?
No, keep going, Coop. It's fine.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Okay. When we talk about so with in Madison, Wisconsin, because of focus interruption and being able to have that partnership with Madison Police Department, it helped us to be able to really navigate differently. So I have two. So I'm the CEO of Focus Interruption. So I have two groups of people. Our outreach teams is really like it says here, as far as being able to kind of navigate the more higher level serious situations that are happening in our community, being able to talk to different community members, and everyone that who I hired is basically they have the same similar lived experience. So we're able to sit down and have conversations that what a lot of times you're not going to be able to have those types of conversations around police or and that's on both ends. We're not trying to be involved in the case, but then also we're able to sit down and being able to, instead of violence more violence happening, we're able to, with the hope of being able to either get people to move out of town or being able to look at things a little bit differently, to being able to solve some of the challenges that are happening right there in the moment, so we can start talking about some of the healing that can take place among families in the midst of a very heated moment. Now, with our community safety workers, they pretty much really focus on lower risk incidents that may happen. It may start off maybe a young man or a young lady that may um, say steal a candy bar out the store, right? So, or you have two neighbors that are arguing, even though it has not yet gotten to that whatever it got into the height of violence. A lot of times, because of our community relationships, there are people that who will actually call us in the community and say, "Hey," or say, "Hey, this is something that we hear that something may happen, or we think that this stuff is getting a little out of hand." But also, even it allows even for MPD to be able, instead of them being in a situation where they have to arrest someone, because it allows our team to actually step in and actually connect with someone, could connect with the parties, if possible. And again, that's not saying, so I want to make sure this is clear, not saying replacing MPD or anything of that nature, but it is also saying that, hey, there's another way of being able to solve community violence or to be able to solve issues without involving law enforcement. If it gets too out of hand, then of course, if either my team or even someone else will end up calling law enforcement at that time. But as I would say, I'm very open in saying this, by the grace of God, we have not really, especially for our community safety workers, have had to go down that route. But we've been able to really be able to use restorative justice in order to have open community conversations about whatever the situation may be at hand.
Yeah, Coop, I appreciate that. I would just add that, with the outreach program, it really is a very direct collaboration with our violent crime investigators. So a few years ago, it was very much a new concept for our detectives, for our officers to arrive to a homicide crime scene and have community partners show up and want to help diffuse the emotional response that's occurring either on the scene or even at the hospital. And it has really become
Mhm.
uh, a regular occurrence now. Anytime that there's an incident of violence, mainly gun violence, an attempted homicide or homicide, where we see Coop or members of Focused Interruption coming in and really not supporting the criminal investigation necessarily, but supporting the overall community response, the police response, but also community response to try and diffuse any further escalation or any reaction violently to what may have occurred. And then the community safety worker that I would just want to add in is that this really started out as a pilot, and so many kudos goes deservingly to Coop on a given week, but this was a pilot that Focus Interruption was willing to embrace early last year. And it was nothing that we had really ever tried before, but it basically employed a two-person team to, like what Coop mentioned, try to diffuse lower level disturbances, which certainly could grow over time if gone unchecked into higher profile or incidents of violence. So we now work with 4 community safety workers and do regular reviews of police incident data and review and look for repeat calls for service addresses within the geographic area they're assigned, and really try to surgically target some of the homes or some of the apartments that might be struggling and growing in conflict with one another. And it's, we've started to kind of refer to them almost as super neighbors, so to speak, where they're connecting people or reconnecting people to services. They're forging relationships that don't exist currently, and they're trying to build community and build a neighborhood where voids may exist currently. So.
Yeah. No, thank you for adding that, John. I think that really, again, it's one of those things that where when we talk about reimagining public safety, we talk about being able to just, it is stepping out of the box and just showing that there are different ways of being able to work together to be able to navigate a system that doesn't always have to lead to arrest. But then also, but at the same time, there are some things, and I've said this publicly, there are people at times you do need to go to jail, right? Or go somewhere to be able to sit down for a little bit. Um, because yeah, that's just the way how it is. But if there are alternatives, I think it's a blessing of being able to say, hey, look, let's look at those alternatives. Let's look at what we can do together to be impactful to that person's life. Something that what I do want to make sure, since we're on this topic, when people are incarcerated, I want to make sure it's that everyone knows this. And me and John has talked about this before. Reentry starts day of incarceration, because most people will come back out into the community, but we also have to be able to figure out ways of being able to support those individuals as well as they're coming back into the community. And it takes our community to be able to be willing to be a part of that support as well. I just wanted to make sure I didn't know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just noticed a question in the chat quick, and I'll just address it real fast. But the outreach team and the community safety workers, they are separate. But certainly we think that the work that the community safety workers are doing, some of our lower level concerns or issues that are occurring in a neighborhood, could certainly build relationships to the point where we may be creating positive gains later on down the road for our outreach team. So hope that addresses the question.
Thank you, JP. I didn't see the question, so thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both. And there are some additional questions coming through in the chat, and I'm keeping an eye on them, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So thank you for those of you that are asking questions, and continue to ask. And I want to thank the team from Madison. We'll get back with them shortly, but I'm going to hand it over to Vice President Lightfoot to talk a little bit about the work happening in Rochester. I think you're muted, Vice Council President. All right, I'm going to move things forward to Lena and see if we can work out the Vice Council President's tech issues. Lena, do you mind?
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you, Kirby. As Kirby originally introduced me, I'm Lena Hackett from the city of Indianapolis, and which is also Marion County. Those two are inclusive of each other. So what I want to talk a little bit about today is our Assessment and Intervention Center. When Mayor Hogsett got into office 5.5, 6 years ago, one of his very first moves was about criminal justice system reform. Indianapolis, like many communities, has a jail that is in serious disrepair. It's really a health and safety concern, and so a new facility needed to be built. But Mayor Hogsett committed to this based on the premise that not only would a new facility be built, but it would be built in the context of a full reform of the criminal justice system with a focus on diversion and keeping people out of the system as frequently as is possible. So there were initiatives that were supportive of that and were strengthened. We have a crisis intervention team, so the response team that has a clinical social worker and a law enforcement officer that can respond in the field. We have detectives who are paired with clinicians who can then do follow-up. So we had some of the pieces. But when you're looking at diverting people out of the criminal justice system, the obvious question is divert to where? So from that, the Assessment and Intervention Center concept was birthed. And so 4 years ago, we started in the development of this, and my job was to keep my arms around it and keep it moving forward. And the organization that I work for does a great deal of community engagement, public health work. So the interest was in having this work while being part of the city. The Assessment and Intervention Center actually belongs to the city of Indianapolis, but the design and drive of it was fully integrating with the community. So I want to talk a little bit about what it is, and then dive into what we're seeing in terms of race and equity. So the Assessment Intervention Center is a physical space, as I said. This is a picture of it. It is well designed to be a therapeutic space, and the mission is, what its purpose is to serve as a intake, stabilization, and connection to services for people who have mental health and substance abuse issues and feel like they need assistance, don't know where to go. So people can self-refer, but really our primary focus was how do we divert people there who have committed a low-level offense, but clearly have a substance abuse or mental health issue that has impacted the fact that they did commit that offense. So instead of them being incarcerated, let's divert them to treatment instead and be able to keep them out of the system and address what's happening to them that's resulting in low-level offenses and often multiple shows into the criminal justice system. So this is a facility that is bright and light, as you can see, focused on stabilization and really figuring out how to get folks committed to resources in the community. A little bit of a picture of what we're seeing now. So the Assessment Intervention Center opened in December. So we are just coming up on a year, and lots of growing pains along the way. But what we're seeing is the most frequent primary substance that's used is alcohol, followed by opioids, and then the secondary substance being stimulants and cannabinoids. And then in terms of behavioral health, and again, please remember these are self-reported issues, but what staff is seeing on initial intake is people are reporting symptoms that would indicate depression and anxiety primarily, then some bipolar disorder and some schizophrenia. One of the things we did to help law enforcement officers make a diversion to the Assessment Intervention Center is we worked with NYU to develop a law enforcement screening tool. It's 11 questions that are built into the police officer's computer system in their car. They can do a screening, ask these simple 11 questions of whomever they're encountering, and by the end of that, they'll get it really is a very simple red flag or green flag of whether there probably is a substance abuse mental health issue that is impacting whatever has happened at that scene. The purpose of that is to give these law enforcement officers a piece of data that helps them figure out what they should do. You know, is it leave somebody at the scene, do an immediate detention, or do a diversion to the Assessment Intervention Center? So that tool, combined with then the intake at the AIC, is where we get to people walk in to do their assessments. I'm going to show a graph of this, but I really just quickly, you know, we track data really very detailed at the AIC because we need to know who's coming, who's not coming, where do we need to improve our services, what kind of impact are we having. So there are people, that blue line that you see are folks who are referred to the Assessment Intervention Center. So many times a law enforcement officer or a service provider, or even we get a great deal of referrals from the emergency department. Those professionals decide that someone is in need of substance abuse or mental health treatment and is in need of being connected to services, so they make a referral. Many of those individuals don't share that opinion, and they're not ready. They're in a contemplative stage. They're not ready to be connected to mental health or substance abuse services. So while there are a great deal of referrals, what we really track is how many people show up, which is that orange dotted line, and you can see it follows the same shape, but it certainly is lower. We're about 70% of the people referred actually do show up. But this is really what we're here to talk about. So when we call something an admission into the Assessment and Intervention Center, that means that someone has showed up, they've had a screening, they, you know, sometimes, though rarely, whatever their situation is or information that they need can be addressed right there, and they get that information, they get, you know, connected back into whatever system they're in, and they're out in a matter of hours. An admission means that it's maybe a little more complicated to get that person stabilized and be able to reconnect with their services. So they're admitted into the second floor, where we have some beds It's not a shelter, but it's a bed so that if it's going to take a couple days, there's a place for someone to be while it takes a couple of days to get them stabilized. So overwhelmingly, as we look at our data, the Assessment Intervention Center is primarily serving white men. So 71% of the men of the population gender-wise are male, and just less than 25% female. And then when we look at race, we're at about 53% white and about 24% black. This is not reflective of the population in Indianapolis, and it's also not reflective of the population in the jail. So when we look at this data, and I'm going to go up just 2 slides here real quick. Oh, sorry. When we look at what the data looks like for the racial makeup of people who are in the jail, you'll see it's just pretty much the opposite. That overwhelmingly the folks in the jail are black, and with a very small percentage being Latinx or some other gender, and ranging between 40 to 45% white. So this is an alarming picture for us in Indianapolis, because what it would indicate to us is that somehow the diversions are happening in a disproportionate way than folks who are being incarcerated. And I am going to bet that we're not the only community that this is happening in, and the only community that needs to address it. So where we took this information, which honestly is really new information for us to be able to collect and do something about, is so we've developed strategies around how do we address this. What we found out when we went out into the community through our credible messengers, through the mayor's advocates that are out in the neighborhood, and through our neighborhood organizations, is that folks who primarily serve or live in BIPOC communities didn't even know that the Assessment Intervention Center existed. So that meant that referrals were not coming from the communities where folks lived in. And so that's one avenue that we are addressing with community meetings, one-on-ones, information sharing, providing the network of black churches, the Urban League, all of those organizations with very simple methods of how to refer someone who they feel needs these kinds of services to the AIC. But the bigger issue for us is, a portion of the primary purpose of the Assessment and Intervention Center is diversion out of the criminal justice system. So we have worked with this data. We have worked with the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. They see this data on a monthly basis. We look at it by officer who's making a diversion. We look at it by district, and are able to then directly provide information and provide resources that show individuals what's happening in terms of their diversions. What we do know is that the disproportionality is more, interestingly enough, it's heavier when it's coming from the emergency department, when the referral is coming from the emergency department or from the community. And really the law enforcement diversions have leveled out. There was a real disproportionality about that. But when we've looked at the last 2 months of data, that data is trending in the very right direction. So as we've been able to work with law enforcement and the crisis intervention units and the crisis response units, they have been heavily engaged in developing strategies to monitor themselves on this. And we're seeing their data trend the right way. I think many times communities are, this is information that you can choose to not be transparent about. But that doesn't help solve it in any way. So in alliance with Mayor Hogsett's commitment to race and equity throughout the city and throughout the city departments, we've had a lot of support to be able to make this public, be very transparent about it, and engage the community in strategies to resolve the issue. I do want to note that we are still seeing, 2% of the folks coming into the AIC are from the Latinx community. That is fairly in line with what we're seeing in the jail and what we're seeing just in the population as a whole. So this data is not as alarming to us. Then one last thing, as we look at our race and equity data. So the first level is let's look at it across the board to make sure that diversions are happening in an equitable way. If we're controlling for level of charge, level of offense, and background. But we're also engaged in a high utilizers project. So the City of Indianapolis is working on a high utilizers of multiple systems, or a HUMS project as we call it, where we are cross-referencing people who have multiple engagements with the criminal justice system and looking to see where diversions are happening and what other systems they're engaged in. So from that, we decided to look at the AIC data with that HUMS lens. So this first column, and stick with me here, it takes a little bit to think through this. In this first column, this is the total number of assessment and intervention center clients in a sense that that had showed up in a 9-month period. So of the total that had showed up, as you can see, that disproportionality, primarily white, 52%, with only 24% black, that's where that data is showing up. We then looked at that same number, those 933 people, to see who did not have an arrest record at all. So 475 of those folks who came into the AIC had never encountered the criminal justice system, yet the disproportionality remained the same. So that's when that column, that piece of data, is what then led us back to the community, to the strategies that I talked about earlier. Somewhere in the community, because these are folks who are not being referred by law enforcement because they've never had an engagement with the criminal justice system. So coming from the community, we were seeing that disproportionality be even greater. So that led to the strategies about really engaging people close to the issue in helping address the strategies of resolving that. If you look at that third column, those are folks who have an arrest record but wouldn't be what we would call high utilizers. And for our definition of high utilizer for this assessment is that someone had been arrested at least 4 times within a 12-month period. So that's a high utilizer. So that third column are folks who did have an arrest record but were not high utilizers. And you can see we get down to a lower number even, 381 of those folks. So these are still folks that are not at that critical junction of high utilizer. And we're starting to see the disproportionality change a little bit. So, we have a little bit of correction on the disproportionality here with the criminal justice system involvement. And then in that last column, these are our high utilizers. So folks who have been arrested at least 4 times in a 12-month period, have been residents at the jail at least 4 times. And now this population, these demographics are starting to look a little bit even more. We did a 10% jump of what we're seeing in the jail. So what this is telling us is that our system is doing a better job diverting people who have actually had multiple encounters with the criminal justice system with a little bit more equity. Still not there yet, but it's a better picture, which is actually very encouraging for us, because the data would show that this population of frequent utilizers, they have offenses like syringe possession, trespassing, what in many communities wouldn't even be arrestable. These low-level offenses are causing people to be high utilizers, and we're able to get them diverted out, and hopefully diverted out, period, and that we're not going to see them back into the system. So, all of this to say how important it is that communities build systems so that they can cut their data by race, look at their data by race, and start, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Start with what you can get and look at it. Clearly, this is self-report. This is, there could be some swings here or there with bad data, but in general, your trends are going to probably be pretty stable. So start with what you have, and then don't keep it a secret. You can't fix it, within a system all by yourself. So what Indianapolis has done and is still doing, and it's not always comfortable, is stepped out into the community and said, this is what's happening. How do we engage with community to really shift this so that we're ensuring that the Assessment Intervention Center is really paying attention to race and equity in terms of who they're seeing as being diverted and connected and being diverted out of the criminal justice system. And my contact information for anyone who wants to talk about this. We are, as I said, we opened in December, so I really want to say we're not here to say we have figured this out. We're here to say we're really working hard at it and are happy to share anything that we've learned. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena, and thank you for your honesty in sharing your data. It's helpful for others and helpful for this conversation. And we do have some good questions coming through that I'll ask in a moment, but I think we have Willie Lightfoot back on with us, and I'll give him a chance to talk a little bit about what's happening in Rochester.
Hello and greetings to everyone. I hope that you guys can finally hear me. We have these technical issues. Just a little bit about Rochester, New York. My name is Willie Lightfoot. I'm City Council Vice President, also Chairman of Public Safety, Recreation, and Human Services. Rochester is the third largest city in New York State. There's New York City, of course, there's Buffalo, and then there is Rochester. We have about a little over 200,000 population here. Our police force is made up of a little over 700,000 sworn officers, with a budget of about $90 million is the police budget. The city budget is approximately a little over about $600 million. And I would say, I want to honor our presenters and all of the moderator and all and each and every one of you. I want to say that I kind of piggyback off of the last presenter, that this is not work that I can say that anybody probably has pinned down. We in Rochester, we did not start this work overnight. However, we found that where we did start is through the National League of Cities. We started with the Race, Equity, and Leadership Program. Rochester was one of 6 cities chosen in 2018 for Racial Healing and Technical Assistance Initiative. And I bring that to this space because I think that was very important when we got to where we're going, that I'll tell you about in just a few minutes. I believe that the real work that NLC provided ahead of some of the civil unrest and some of the things that Rochester went through that was national news, I believe helped us format and be able to switch and pivot to some of the work that we're currently doing now intentionally without having as much lack of understanding, because we had already started doing this real initiative in 2018. We launched the Let's Get Real Rochester, the Racial Equity and Leadership Team under the guidance of Mayor Lovely Warren. And so we began to do that work. As a result of doing that work, we found that we eventually end up having a very national situation with the Daniel Prude case, which happened of a man that was killed or that was died, but it was presented as if he was killed. That's how it was presented, but he died in police custody. But people had that type of narrative that was going on, which caused a significant amount of civil unrest in this city. As a result of that civil unrest, even though it was deemed by the Attorney General's office that he was not murdered or killed by the police officer, but it was perceived that way. And we know that most times perception becomes people's reality, especially in the court of public opinion. We had, prior to then, a lot of our the police accountability work was currently being done by a civilian review process that we had. But that civilian review process sat under the police department's umbrella. So their budget was done by the police department. They answered by the police department, and that caused a significant amount of distrust within the community. So there was a referendum that was done in our city, and overwhelmingly 70% of the people voted to create a independent police accountability review board. Which ultimately was passed, put into effect, into law, and then we created the individual independent police accountability board, which we moved out the budget of the police department, moved into the budget of the city council. So the overview site, uh, people over that was the body of city council, and the budget was under the city council's budget. As a result of some of that work, and as a result of the death of Daniel Prude, the community really wanted to move towards more of a non-police response. Now, prior to that, me being in charge of public safety, it was called public safety. It was called DRIVE, Department of Recreation, Youth and Youth Services. We changed and shifted and pivoted from that work based on other work that we had already started through a program called the Rock Against Gun Violence Coalition, which I started this program, beginning to look and deal with homicides and responses to homicides and crisis and things of that nature. This was prior to Daniel Prude. We were seeing a gap in responses to homicides, responses to violence within our community. As a result of that work, we were able to realize that there was some human service work that we were currently and in the past have been providing. We were providing the Family Crisis Intervention Team, which crisis counseling to victims directed after crisis had occurred, assessed and counsel clients, and connects to services coordinated between services provided and follow-up case management. We had the Victim Assistance Unit, which was a crisis support service after a crime, home or hospital visits, explanation of the criminal justice system, referrals to other agencies, transportation to and from court for victims and witnesses who have exhausted all other means of transportation, assistance in filing New York State crime victim compensation. So these programs had been around for quite some time, a couple of decades. We were currently doing these programs, but we found that as a result of the civil unrest, the lack of the police and community relations was fractured, that we needed to go a step further. So as a result, again, backing up to the racial equity and leadership work, which we were doing and working throughout departments and being intentional about looking at our entire services, all of our services, not just policing, with a racial equity lens, we then intentionally was working towards creating an equity budget tool, which we end up codifying in our charter so that we begin to look at all of the departments with a racial equity lens. And so it wasn't just policing. We expanded, realizing that racial and structural inequities are in all systems. And so that was a tool that was helping us as we were building out these services, that was helping us to be able to look intentionally in these services with a racial equity lens. After the Daniel Prude case, there was a high demand in the community for non-police responses. So we began to build out models out of the Cahoots program. We began to look at their model, and we created the homicide response team, which responds to 4 to 6 member teams to each homicide and support families and victims. We created a crisis coordinator and then a coordinated response throughout city response. We also created a person in crisis team, the PIC team, formed to be an alternative to a law enforcement response, responding to mental health, domestic violence, and other identified crises that first responders normally attend to. The team will be emergency response to social workers working through our 911 dispatch, our 211 dispatch. Protocols and training was done. An advisory committee was created. And during this same time, as a result of the civil unrest, as a result of us pivoting and changing our services, because normally the county normally provides the human services, but the city now, we heard the demand of the community, and we began to expand our services that we were providing to also include the Race Commission, which the Race Commission was established by the mayor and the county executive, which was Race and Structural Equity Commission, which was then in turn, a 21-member commission was put together and came up with a report. All of these reports The real initiative are all online on our city website, or can easily be Googled and get this information. The race instructional equity report was done, created in such a way where it looked at, again, at least 9 areas: education, housing, policing, criminal justice, and etc. And recommendations were given. The governor at the time created Executive Order 203, where he required all municipalities within New York State to meet within a certain time frame to have a plan to address community policing and reimagining policing within their municipalities. We met that demand from the governor, and which in turn turned to our Executive Order 203 plan, which is also available online as well too. In those plans, we also addressed, a lot of our different policies, practices, procedures, many with a racial equity lens, pretextual incidences, stop and frisk, no chokeholds, and how to handle different events where we had large gatherings and we had protesting and things of that nature, how to de-escalate, and different types of trainings. So these were just some of the things, many of the things, but we were able to, these things didn't happen. The reason we were able to pivot so quickly into a lot of this work was because a lot of this work had already started prior to our civil unrest, and we had already set some framework, especially for the racial equity pieces, were already being set because we were getting this assistance from NLC with the Real Initiative. So, and a part of moving this work forward was to look at best practices that we saw happening in other cities. We now have the Peacemaker program, which we're just launched a pilot program that we pulled out of Richmond, Oakland. We're looking at Newark, New Jersey, and some of the work that they're doing. We just currently opened up and hired our first coordinator for the Office of Neighborhood Safety, which is very similar to a Mayor Office of Gun Prevention or Violence Prevention. So these are, a lot of the tools that we're currently using. And just to give you some of our statistics, I'm sorry I don't have a PowerPoint, but I'll give you just some of the statistics and data around the work that's currently happening. Now, our Office of Neighborhood Safety has just recently opened within the last few months. 25 being enrolled in the Peacemaker Fellowship Program through that Office of Neighborhood Safety. Our Pathways program, Pathways to Peace program, is a violence intervention program that's been around here in our city for decades. They see and help assist over 1,100 cases per year. Our AmeriCorps program, we have 31 enlisted in there. Our Crisis Intervention Services, which again was a recent, within the last year and a half, total over 4,400 calls. Our PIC team in the first 10 months had 3,500 calls that they responded to. And our community support team services have responded to over 900 calls. So again, this work, we don't have all of our answers. We're currently, as many of the cities across the country have experienced and or are experiencing, working tirelessly to build our police and our community relations. We just passed recently $5 million to go to our police accountability review board to fully staff them, to fully provide them with all that they need in order to begin to see cases and to begin to do the work that they were able to do. They had 5 pillars. Everything and all of the pillars were provided, with the exception of discipline, which we took all the way to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, we lost that battle. But at the same time, we're getting ready to appeal that and go forward. We're still trying to maintain all of the pillars of the Police Accountability Board, to include discipline, but that is still being fought in court. And these are just a few of the tools that we are doing, how we got there, some of the tools that we are using, and some of the data since we have implemented some of these programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Council President. And thanks to all of you. Obviously, each city that's talked today is at a different point in their journey and has different struggles and successes to share. So I think we can actually drop the slides. I'm going to try to manage both the questions that came through the question and answer box and also some that we had prepared in advance. And if I can ask the team from Madison, a question came through asking about the training for your community safety workers and how equity plays into that. So if you have some feedback on how that works, we'd love to hear it.
Oh, sorry, I was trying to make sure I unmuted, and you can't see me either. Oh, there we go. All right, sorry about that. So mainly what we kind of focus our training on as far as de-escalation and also like motivational interviewing, especially for our community safety workers. And it's the same for our outreach team as well. Madison is a pretty small community, and by us most of the time working, most of my team also has secondary jobs. So being able to work, one of the men who I work that works with us, actually he is a state coordinator around reentry as well. Another young man runs in my with my other hat. As many people may know, most people who work for nonprofits wear many hats in our communities. So also runs my Man Up program that I host with for Nehemiah as well. So as well as being able to connect with individuals as well as networking with our county jails. So we kind of utilize our and this is me just kind of just really putting it out there as far as we utilize the escalation training and all of that stuff, but a big part of it comes from the fact that we know how to navigate our communities and being able to really build those relationships. I think has been a real true measure of what you want to call success, and how we're just able to connect. Because in Madison, I've been in Madison since I was around 16, and originally from Chicago, and it's the fact that where most of the people who we come encounter with is always, hey, if you don't know, either it's by reputation or by being able, if we may have worked with a family member of theirs, and that also adds another layer of being the trusted messenger as well, which has worked for us, and being able to step into scenes that what many people, even law enforcement, would not have been able to. So I look at all those as many blessings, as well as other AODA certifications and things of that nature. We try to make sure our staff is trained on and continue to be trained on throughout our community.
I think if I can add to that a little bit, I think part of the success too is just our efforts, Coop, wouldn't you say, to really force relationship building between the police department and your staff, and the CSWs in particular work very closely with our neighborhood officers. So we have 8 neighborhoods throughout the city that have a police officer directly assigned. They're not primary call responders, but they're more of a problem-oriented, individual that is meant to collaborate with the community in that geographic neighborhood. But they work very closely with the CSWs, and really it's a team approach when they're analyzing data to decide which families or which neighbors are best to try intervention with.
Right. Yep, I would definitely agree with that, and it helps. It helps that piece of the partnership definitely helps because, because there are some things that our team is not equipped to be able to step into, and we have no problem with being able to say that, right? Or even if we're talking, if we may talk to a neighborhood officer, and we'll say, hey, you know what? Maybe if there's even bad blood there, we also have that conversation as well. If not this member of the team, maybe another member of our team can probably be the best person to approach it. Um, I really feel that has been, as some folks in our community, we kind of talk about like what's the magic sauce, besides, and I must add, prayer is a big part of that as well. So, and that's, I mean, I'm kind of smirking to myself, but that is the 100% truth, right? In every situation, we walked into some situations that prayer is what led us in there, and also what led us out of there, and being able to de-escalate some situations as well in the heat of a moment, in the heat of the moment. So.
Thank you. And Lena, a question came through, well, two questions came through that I'm going to kind of combine into one, just about, number one, the assessment tool and how it was developed and how equity plays a role and how people are trained to utilize it. And then also kind of what strategies have come together to reduce some of the disparities from the police department's end as it relates to the diversion center. So if you can kind of answer both of those questions, that would be great.
Sure, and if I missed something, nudge me. So the law enforcement assessment tool was, as I said, was developed in partnership with NYU. They approached Indianapolis because they were doing other work with us, and apparently, and I didn't know this at the time, there is no validated mental health assessment tool for law enforcement. There's the brief jail mental health screen. There's things for clinicians, but nothing that had been validated for law enforcement use. So through a 20-month process, we worked with NYU in the development of the tool, and they brought in, all of the folks who had done the development of all of the other assessment tools. So we had a room full of super smart folks, and they first came up with a 23-question assessment tool, which we knew wasn't going to fly with law enforcement. But then in the first round of it, narrowed it down to really 11 questions were effective. We validated it for use, and then we validated it for relationship for the screening to a full assessment, and it's now a full tool. NYU is managing the rollout of that tool now, and they've done some pretty cool things in addition to developing it that's now an app as well. So, which is super helpful for law enforcement who have cell phones, because they can do it right there, on their phone, rather than going back into their car and using the computer in their car. The intent is that law enforcement officers use it on every one-day encounter, if they can, if the scene is safe enough for them to do that. Because the pitch is that you may think you know in your gut, because you've been a law enforcement officer for 20 years, you feel like you know, and you might be right, but this tool provides you another piece of data, which is very strongly related to what was our most effective tool in terms of the race and equity. It's that law enforcement screening tool, because it has been validated with race and equity impact. So if a law enforcement officer uses the tool and then takes the guidance from the tool and that piece of data, then their subjectivity has been taken out of it. But I will also say, as effective was being able to show people their data. So being able to go into each district, we went to roll calls 24 hours a day. We went to roll calls and just demonstrated data to them, and continued to update their data, posted it in their district offices so they could see their own data, which encourages people to use that tool. And it's all a cycle. And then, of course, did what many people across the community are doing. All of the law enforcement officers took part in a 2-day Interrupting Racism interactive training session, and it is part of the training academy now as well. So those are the things we've done. Showing people their data and really getting people to use that tool are the most powerful.
And there are questions about whether the tool is publicly accessible. Is that?
It is accessible. I absolutely can connect you to the folks at NYU, because they are managing it and the rollout. So it's not something you can go online and just download, because clearly they're NYU, so they're doing research around it. But happy to connect you as they're rolling it out to other sites. Probably get that information through you, Kirby. But sure, we can get that done.
Great, thank you. And I know we're running a little short on time. I think we have about 10 or so minutes left, but I wanted to kind of ask each of you to think about the next 12 to 18 months and whether it's something that you already have planned or something you would like to see happen as it relates to equity, whether it's racial equity, gender equity, or neighborhood equity in your response to crisis. So when you think about what you're either planning or would love to see happen as it relates to equity and crisis response, what's the vision that comes to mind? And I'll start with Vice Council President Lightfoot.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to. I'm very excited about the Reimagining Task Force toolkit coming out. I think that that could be helpful for municipalities. So I'm very excited about that. With us here in Rochester, because we have the race report, because we have the Executive Order 203, I think that those are blueprints for us here locally. And I would implore other communities to consider, again, working with the Race, Equity, and Leadership through NLC. I would also encourage them to look at putting a committee together for and structural equity around all systems within their communities. With us, for the first time in the history, we were able to connect the city and county working collectively together, which has never been done. So I'm very excited about the work that we've already worked on and the plans that we've already put together and working to implementing those plans. Thank you.
Thank you. John and Anthony, thoughts? And you can answer individually.
Go ahead, John. You want to go?
No, I would say there's oh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Coop.
I really just think the whole thing of really focusing on public health and being able to expand what they are doing and being able to team up and allowing them to understand the practices between the community as well as the institution. And, you know, we have some ways and strategies of being able to work together and being able to make sure that everyone's being able to play on an even playing field. I think is the best way of being able to really describe it, giving the perspective their jobs and things of that nature, but also saying, okay, hey, look, how we have to include the community and what we have to do going forward. But law enforcement, community members, the homeless person that's on the street, they are all a part of the community, right? The youth, I think of us really trying to not only grabbing the data, but then also making sure that people understand that we can't have a cookie cutter approach to what's going on in our community. I think that'd be the best way of explaining it for me.
I would agree with that, and I think there's certainly some momentum building behind our CSW model. And now that public health has become involved, I saw a question earlier about the evaluation of our program. There was a short evaluation done at the first year of the pilot program. There will be another at the end of this, but there's certainly, like I said, momentum to grow this and to start including other neighborhoods. And I'm most excited, I guess, around how we collaborate and continue to include community, public health, members of focus interruption, police in evaluating where the next teams should not only be located, but how they perform their day-to-day. So I think has been a critical part of the success of the program, and hopefully that will continue.
Lena?
I would think of two things, and I'm thinking where would I want Indianapolis and Marion County to move forward in the next 18 months. We are still in development on having a true community response to some of the 911 dispatch calls. So we're able to do a law enforcement response, we're able to do a mental health response, but I really would like to do be able to develop what Albuquerque has developed in terms of a community-based response, and having that community-based response be from the communities people come from. So that piece we're still working on. And then, our high utilizer of multiple systems project has been in development for 18 months. It's super cool right now, but it's a project, and we need to make it a program, and we need to make that race equity piece go across all of the high utilizers, because we have that same disproportionate impact in our homeless community. So I want to see it all done as a system rather than individual silos.
And while I thought that would be the last question, another question came through that's somewhat related, and maybe in about a minute each, if you could talk a little bit about kind of what a working group looks like, or what a team looks like, and what stakeholders need to come together around implementing plans like this, and either those that you involved or those that you wish you would have involved to kind of create a comprehensive team like that. So if you all could just talk about who's at the table to ensure that this works and that there's equity in about a minute or less. So I'll start with the team from Madison.
I guess I'll say it real quick. I think we really try to involve everyone. I think the flip side of it is that some folks decided to be a part of it in the beginning, but didn't understand the process. And I think so then eventually you'll have certain individuals or agencies that they just don't. The concept was so new, even though it is very old when you really look at the historical piece of it. This isn't any, but it's definitely new to Madison, and a lot of people didn't feel as though it was going to be possible. And now that it is, I think some of we're having different conversations with other agencies. So yes, I think in Madison we did our best to try to involve as many trusted people as possible and organizations.
I would say for Indianapolis, we made sure that it was interdisciplinary, that anyone who had any touch in the work we were doing was at the table, and more importantly than that was that they were the decision makers. So that every meeting we had moved a decision to the next, and it wasn't just having the same conversation and somebody having to go back and ask their boss. We really, and because the mayor was behind it, we made sure the decision makers were at the table.
I would also say that to add to what was already said, that you also have to have all levels of government should be at the table, because many of these issues they cross different government protocols, practices, laws, etc. And then I also would say I would challenge people not to bring the same people that always come to the table. That is a recipe for disaster. Because if you keep doing the same thing with the same people, you're going to keep getting the same results. So I would challenge you to really touch your youth and to really reach out, make sure all levels of government are involved and have committed, and also that you have to have not the normal people. Bring in new folks, but that are still credible within the community.
I think that is an excellent way to wrap up this conversation. And I want to thank all of you for joining me this afternoon, and to CSG for having us and have this conversation about equity. I think what I took away from this is that nobody has it 100% right, but everyone is thinking about it, and many people are taking steps in the right direction. And when we recognize things are not equitable and there are disparities, addressing them and bringing in new people and new ideas is important. So I want to thank everyone for being here and for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for your participation in this session, which we hope you've enjoyed. We will now be brought to the main room for wrap-up and team directions.